Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, we've had several episodes about literacy and reading. One area that we haven't talked much about specifically within reading is poetry. And quite clearly, poetry serves a purpose beyond it just being beautiful prose. It helps our students to think critically. And poetry, besides being a great tool to promote critical thinking, helps to demonstrate to students how they can use language to represent perspective and to show emotion. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to be joined by my next guest on the Have a Life Teaching podcast, and her name is Jewellyn Forrest. Jewellyn is a national writing consultant and co-founder of Autonomy Learning. And how I heard about Jewellyn was actually by reading her piece about figurative language in the ASCD blog. I thought there'd be very few people as good as Jewellyn to talk about the beauty of poetry and in particular figurative language, and not only talk about its importance, but how do we actually get students vested in creating poetry and understanding poetry. So Jewellyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Jewellyn, before we get into poetry and figurative language, could you tell us a little bit more about your background as an educator and how poetry became an area of interest and specialty for you?
I've been in education for over 32 years. And as I was beginning, I think I felt like a lot of teachers where writing is this thing that is so scary because you don't want to do it wrong. In front of kids, you want this perfect product. And yet, as I've discovered, the more that you write with them and show them how powerful they are using their words and communication, and that writing isn't a formula and they don't have to follow a perfect box. It really unlocks so much about how they read and how they interact with learning. So, my journey to become a writer was through the National Writing Project, where I was sitting side by side writing my own narrative next to people who are writing a screenplay. And I was, whoa, this is how it feels as a student to be intimidated. What is this writing process? But then to actually, through the process, understand how I'm communicating who I am, and that as much as that's a risk, that is a pure joy.
I love that. And yes, especially if we talk about where learning is going in the 21st century. So much, and I'm sure you can relate to this, Jewellyn, as an educator, so much of how we teach now in the 21st century is about students sharing voice, sharing perspective, having them in the driver's seat of learning. Whenever and however you have students writing, that is an important way to do that. So now, if we look at poetry specifically, how did that become your area of interest?
Poems, I believe, because of the economy of words, are so powerful. Each and every word is chosen with such intention, whether it be, I want these things to rhyme because I want to be playful, or if I want them to rhyme because I want to really make a point about everything about how things are structured. I always talk to kids that so much is said in a very short amount. And that can be intimidating once you realize I have to say more with less. But then for kids that are more reluctant writers, sometimes less feels like an invitation to step into something because they don't have to have all the words with it.
And you were saying just now that it is a really great tool to get students communicating in writing. particularly for students who might struggle in writing or in explaining something, that its conciseness can actually help students to almost give them an on ramp onto writing. So that's definitely, I think, one benefit or one reason why we want to teach poetry. And I talked a little bit in the introduction about some of the ways that I think poetry can help students learn. But what are your thoughts as a writing and poetry consultant? What would you say to people who say, why do my students need to know poetry?
Well, poetry can take on so many different forms. So I'm in the higher ed space part time as well. And I know that my students are still struggling to learn that writing is communication and it's not a form to fill out and be done. Poetry has so much investment from a writer as opposed to something that they can create on AI. And I know that becomes a conversation. AI can't spit out your voice in the same way that you can. Poetry is important because of what we've just said in terms of kids need to understand that they're learning and that their writing is an expression of who they are. It opens the door for curiosity in so many other subject areas. If they can see themselves as powerful writers and they can see themselves as poets, they will start to see themselves as readers. They will see themselves as mathematicians. They will see themselves as scientists. It's a door, again, into a larger learning experience.
And in fact, you make me think of my follow-up question to that, because then that's going to get us into talking specifically about figurative language and your article. And my question is this. So poetry is a door, and it gets students to see them and see the importance of how they can show their voice. With that said, what makes a good poem good?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to what you said before. Poetry gets kids to read about different perspectives and express themselves and express different perspectives. I think it's that understanding that poetry is so personal and it's so close to a person. And when it's made more formulaic, it doesn't feel the same. What makes a poem good to me can be different also for you. And I think that's another benefit, actually, is the flexibility of poetry, to be honest with you, because what learning has become is a lot about doing and a lot about following and being like everyone else. And poetry is that ability to again see things from so many different perspectives and to analyze. There are many examples of how writers have written poems and people have said, oh, analyze this poem, and the poet themselves is like, that's not what I intended at all. So we're all bringing our own experiences into it because it is terse and it is left with interpretation. That's what's cool about poetry, is that you can't just put it in a box, and it does mean that you have to bring yourself to it.
I agree with you that poetry really should be in the eye of the beholder and what the poet wants to create. But I guess, and this aligns with the article where I learned about you talking about figurative language, what are those general elements that a poem should have in it that then, once people know what those elements are, they could break the rules when it comes to writing poetry?
I think one of the things that poets think a lot about is audience. So you have to know your audience intent, the intent that you have, and what impact you want to have on your audience. You need to understand what structure you want. Free verse is one thing, but that's actually sometimes really hard to do. So sometimes knowing the structure of what you want to accomplish, and you can pick the form that works. I think it's understanding the different devices that you can use. Like, you do want to use repetition. And if you are, what are you using it for? So I think it's that mindfulness of, again, the different components that we teach about poetry. But instead of telling them, you need to have this or this or this here, what are they choosing and why? What impact are they choosing that tool for? For example, with figurative language, it's not just, hey, can we make comparisons? It's, why are we making that comparison, and what do you want your audience to understand? And a lot of times when we're reading poetry, that's the first thing we ask too, is what does that evoke from you as the reader? What was that author trying to do? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, those are the kinds of pieces. Am I kind of following what you're asking on that?
You are, because what I'm thinking is this. So we have a lot
Mhm.
of listeners that are educators across the K-12 spectrum. And as we know, Jewellyn, especially for our elementary educators might be teaching subjects that they're comfortable with, and they might be teaching subjects that they're not comfortable with. Off camera, we were talking about, and I'm going to own it, poetry is not my area of expertise. If I was going to be teaching poetry, yes,
Mhm.
I want to know those components. So you mentioned figurative language, and you were saying that figurative language is a comparison. So what I'm getting out of that is, oh, instead of saying something explicitly, making
Mhm.
a comparison to something and then allowing the reader or the listener to then make a connection to something else. And that's where the critical thinking piece comes in for our students, because they have to be able to read between the lines and make those connections. So, other
Yes.
than figurative language, because we're going to get into figurative language specifically, what are those other components of poetry? Let's say our teachers, if they're going to be teaching a poetry unit, should be instructing their students on.
I think there needs to be a rich examination of a lot of different kinds of poetry. When you say poetry straight off, most is like rhyme and the beat, which is very true. But if you look at a variety, you look at the intent verses and the stanzas and the lines. How are those structured? How many of them are there? What's the title? How all those things are a part of what makes a poem. And again, understanding the difference between formats of them and then free verse. What are we going to do with those different kinds of text structures? So you want to be able to teach and start with examining what poetry does to them as readers and understanding this line. Every single piece of poetry is on purpose. And that's what I tell my students, that every single word chosen, and this is true for writing in all senses, I believe, is that every word is chosen with intention, but especially so in poetry. So knowing which type of poems that you have in your standards, which poetry fits your grade level standards, going through those and then immersing them and really pulling out all of the patterning and the things that you see there, rather than the explicit, hey, this is what a haiku is, and here's how many lines there is. Here, so going the backwards way and being able to immerse them in it and have them pick out patterns is the way that I would start in terms of teaching poetry, and having them experience as an audience and then be able to do it themselves piece by piece.
Then, when we're talking about figurative language, component or element of poetry, could you walk us through what is figurative language? And then tell us about the novel way you teach figurative language. I think you called it in the article the figurative language stretch.
So, starting out being explicit about experiences with kids to tell them the difference between description and figurative language. What is really literal, and when do we want to elaborate and use very specific description? Starting there and then being able to start immersing them into some that's like, well, is this really what's happening? Right. And, or is this sort of, there's a different meaning there. And taking standards and looking at what your grade level needs to cover in terms of literacy techniques and figurative languages, usually similes, metaphors, whatever you have. And I will teach them one by one, and we will do a lot of reading and exploring and again finding those patterns. And instead of my telling them a simile is this or this, it's more, hey, what do you notice about every simile, every metaphor? What are you noticing? And being able to go through each type of figurative language with that and making sure that they recognize the differences, and then having them start to play and really helping them create their own. And kids love that. And then as all of the different figurative language pieces are uncovered and taught, and you see that kids are mastering that, I do what's called figurative language stretch, which is we have a topic. And it might be, I'm gonna start with dog. They love talking about dogs. And I'll say, I'll do a think aloud, which is to be able to model for them and think aloud exactly what you're thinking. So I'll have dog at the top of my paper and I'll say, I'm going to think of a simile about this. What do I remember about similes? And we'll pull out our resources and check back. And I write a simile about a dog. And then I'll write metaphor. So when I do a simile, it's like this. Oh, when I do a metaphor, oh. And then, hey, what would be onomatopoeia for a dog? Oh, bark. Okay, excellent. And so it becomes this play with words, but in a really cool way that compares each type next to each other. And then what I really want them to get at is not just that you can write all these different kinds, but which do you want to take to your poems and your writing and why? If I'm using bark, that's going to be completely different than I'm going to say my dog's fur is white like whipped cream. There's different uses for that. And being able to see it right next to each other and then to say with intention, hey, this is what I want to put in my writing and why. That really brings their poetry to life.
So students will look at all the different types of figurative language, if I'm understanding correctly, and then figure out which ones they want to use in their poem and why. How do you use the stretch to have them complete or compose a complete poem?
That's a great question. Once I've taught them how to do the figurative language stretch, they take off and run with it. They might have a different topic for a poem and they'll do that almost like a pre-write to get their ideas generated. And then they might say, I'm going to be writing this poem, and they have ready-made pieces that they want to insert. And we'll look at the structure of the poem that you're doing. Okay, so you need to have this here, or you want to have this here. Where would that best fit? So as they're writing, they have pre-write tool right there. And it's something that they can take with them, and they don't have to create a new worksheet every time. It's something that they can just do right there on the paper. And all they need to do is write the different types of figurative language and the topic at the top, and then they go to town. It's really cool when they start sharing them with each other too, because there might be two kids that have the same topic, and we start talking about the differences in the way that they wrote their similes or the way that they wrote their metaphors. And they start realizing that we're not stealing ideas from each other. We're generating ideas and all thinking about it differently. And again, it's that cool piece of perspective. We don't all see this the same way. And that's what's cool about figurative language.
And what also is neat about it is it gets students talking with other students about poetry. And to
100%.
And to your point, not just sharing their poetry, but learning about how other people approach the same topic. And to your point about perspective building, what a great exercise in student voice. So that leads me to my next question,
Yeah.
Jewellyn, which is your article in ASCD talked about doing figurative language stretch with young students. How would you modify this with different age groups of students, say elementary, middle, and high school, even
Right.
university?
Older kids, we assume they have knowledge of these things, but there's so much. So making sure that first I would probably pre-assess where they're at and ask them to talk about, what do you know about similes? And then what are some similes? And I might even pull out different current advertisements. How are they using these in a different way? Instead of just poetry, but getting them to think about how people play with words. And then again, immersing them in literature rich with figurative language, whether it's poetry or it's narrative, nonfiction, there's comparisons. Having them do some searching as you're reading, go find me a simile and then let's examine it. I've done this with middle schoolers and high schoolers where they realize that it frees them. They know similes, they know metaphors, they're writing their piece and they get stuck. Like, how do I want this to be? They can pause and write out this figurative language stretch apart from what they're actually writing. It gives them a moment to pause from the form, to be creative and explore, and then go back to it. And it brings the rhythm back. It's being able to see what they can do with the different levels. And then as they get older, of course, there's so many different literary devices that you can do this with. It could be that you bring in repetition, you bring in all the different things and say, how would you do that with this topic? And having them play around with stretching those words and the way they would express it in writing.
You were already talking about this a little bit, Jewellyn, when you were talking about students talking together
Yeah.
about their similes on a similar theme. So that got me thinking, in your experience, because like you
Yeah.
said, you've taught this figurative language stretch across K-12 and even at the university level. So
Mhm.
what have been some exciting success stories that you've seen? What made you feel proud and happy to be teaching poetry to students? And then when it goes wrong, where are the challenge areas for students? And how do you, as an educator, overcome those? Two-part question.
One of the things I think is really important in teaching writing is that you pause with your class and you highlight, spotlight, and celebrate. I'm picturing all my kids on the carpet, and we've got our portfolio notebooks, and we're writing and we're doing this figurative language stretch, and I'm doing butterfly conferences with them. That sense of community as writers, a community of writers, is a really important piece to have, celebrating right alongside and saying that was a really unique idea, or being able to, even myself, go to more struggling readers and say that's a really unique idea, you need to amplify that, you need to share that with everybody, and seeing how that bolsters the community and makes them more, again, ready to share, because it's not a full formed piece. Figurative language stretch is literally on a piece of paper and it may have 5 different sentences on it. We celebrate the process, but it's a very low stakes opportunity to write. And so there's a lot of ways that you can, again, have them turn and talk and celebrate that. When it goes wrong, I think that's the part where normalizing that we're all in process and thinking about it and knowing when to nudge a student and help. Hey, there's a part here, instead of, oh, you've got your simile wrong, right? You want to say, okay, I see a strong start. We cherish each other's writing and value each other's risk taking when it comes to writing. And when I write in front of students, I'm always saying, thank you so much for letting me risk in front of you. I know this isn't going to be perfect, and I appreciate you caring for my feelings as I'm writing. And so modeling that with them. But if unkind words are said, how could we say that differently? What strength do you see? Let's start there. Just to be able to identify figurative language, one whole level, then to be able to interpret, and then to be able to actually write one, and then to be able to go in between. All of those levels of learning is completely different thinking. That's really, again, like you're saying, exercising the different modes of thinking. So it's not just, hey, I know figurative language, check, check. It's, I know how to use it. I know how to use it flexibly. I know how to apply it.
What work have you done with other teachers
Mm.
in helping them do the figurative language stretch? What have you found teachers have needed from you to feel confident enough to teach poetry themselves? Because, like I said, if you asked me to be teaching figurative language or poetry, I'd be probably knocking on your classroom door every 5 minutes.
One of the things I would say first is that's okay. We're all starting as reading poetry, understanding figurative language. That's a quest that is everybody's. So I think number one, talking with teachers, I want to free you up to say that you don't have to have all the answers. That's okay to say that to kids too, and that we're going to explore the power of words right now. And if we put words in different orders, look what it does here, look what it does here. So again, I would say, and I say this about any kind of teaching, you are the lead learner. You need to go into this space of teaching poetry as, I'm still learning too. Ideas that you create are going to make me think differently. And we're all in that space. So, hey, this is what I have, and I'm going to facilitate what we've got here, but let's learn this together and let's create as a class and figure out this together. I think one of the easiest ways to burn out as a teacher is to feel like you need to have it all. You need to know it all, and you need to be the one imparting it all. Being the sage on a stage is very tiring. The biggest joys of teaching is when I can say, wow, I have never thought of that. You made me think differently. I'm so glad you shared that. And for them to be like, wow, it wasn't a right or a wrong. And that's the trick as a teacher, to create a space where kids will risk. But again, you have to be a risk taker too, and to be willing. And that's okay. And I know that's a hard thing as a teacher.
But again, as you were speaking, I heard a couple of times, and digressing a little bit away from teacher and back to students, I heard celebration several times. What are the ways in which you have celebrated student poetry?
One of my favorite routines that I can put into any subject is called a mic drop moment, where we all have just 2 to 3 minutes where I say, hey, who has a mic drop moment? And they will raise their hands and they will share something that they either struggled with, a mistake that they learned from. It might be something that they worked really hard on and they did well today. And the whole class listens, and then we all together raise our hands and we drop our imaginary mic and we say mic drop. And so it's just one of those things to, again, celebrate as a community. The end result isn't all what we celebrate, it's the process. Make time for students to talk with each other and space to share their writing. That in itself, and having an authentic audience, is a big part of celebration. Notebooks and portfolios. I love having writing notebooks where they go home and they get to explain to their parents what they did today and how they did it. And parents get to see it and then it comes back. It's a living, breathing work of learning. Being able to tell parents, hey, don't edit, just say, amazing. Thank you for sharing those ideas with us today. We're so excited. So I always send a little thing home and say, hey, your child's bringing this home. You praise the fact that they're sharing it with you and that they created something unique.
Aspect of poetry that excites me is
Mhm.
that because this is coming from inside of a person, it's also an opportunity not just to celebrate the individual, but celebrate whatever cultural background they have, personal knowledge they have. So it can really serve as an equity piece.
It opens the door for kids to discover more about themselves. I think sometimes when they think they're writing something so simple and you lean in and say, this is really big. And then they're able to say, this is really big. And they have so many things about them that are so unique. And this is a great way to open that door for sure.
We've talked about a lot of aspects of poetry. In fact, not just about figurative language. What have we not talked about that you want the listeners to know?
I think it goes back to creating a community of writers and starting with that and having intentional goals. Whatever type of writing that you're doing, becoming part of their community of writers and celebrating that, especially now in the age of AI, everybody's afraid of writing becoming something you can put a prompt in and whoop, there it is. But once kids know that someone is listening to what they've written and that what they write matters, they won't lose that. My first year of kindergartners are all 36 and having their own kids. And they will time and time again say, it wasn't about the type of writing that we did. It was that I learned about myself as a writer and who I was and what my voice was. And if a student can walk out of your classroom with that, that's gold.
Where can people find out more about you and the work you do?
Autonomylearning.com is our website.
Thank you so much for your time today, Jewellyn.
Thank you, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.